of November 2016. This evening I shall give a talk based on one of the sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. There's Rakta Vinita Sutta. It's translated as the relay chariots. So we should realize that in order to attain enlightenment or nibbana, we have to go through these 7 stages of purifications. So this is the purpose of living the holy life under the Buddha. The 7 stages of purification are the first one, or Sila Visuddhi, or purification of moral conduct. The second, or Citta Visuddhi, purification of mind. The third, Ditthi Visuddhi, purification of view. The fourth, Kankha Vitarana Visuddhi, or purification by overcoming doubts. The fifth, Magga Yana Dasana Visuddhi, or purification by knowledge and vision of what is the path and what is not the path. Number 6, Patipada Yana Dasana Visuddhi, or purification by knowledge and visions of the path. And 7th, Jnana Dasana Visuddhi, or purification of knowledge and visions. So if one has not yet attained the first stage of purification, then it is not possible to attain the second stage of purifications. So when one has attained the first stage of purification, or Sila Visuddhi, then one would attain the second stage of purification, or Citta Visuddhi. So if one has not attained the Citta Visuddhi, then it's not possible to attain Ditthi Visuddhi. So this sutta is about the conversations between Venerable Punna Manta Niputta and Venerable Sariputta. Venerable Punna Manta Niputta is endowed with a lot of good qualities, and he is highly respected by other bhikkhus or by his companions in the bhikkhuhood. For example, he has only a few wishes, so he talks to other bhikkhus on fewness of wishes. He himself is contented, so he talks to the other monks, bhikkhu, on contentment. So in other words, he himself possesses all the good virtues, so he talks to other bhikkhus about these good virtues. So we can say that he leads by example. So Venerable Sariputta heard about his good name, so wanted to meet him very much. So when Venerable Sariputta met him, so Venerable Sariputta asked him, for the sake of what that the holy life is lived under the Buddha or under the Buddha Sasana. So the essence of their conversation is about the 7 stages of purification. And Venerable Punna Manta Niputta also explains a simile. It's because many wise ones could understand the simile easily. So Venerable Puna Manta Niputta said, suppose that the king Pasinadi of Kosala, who was living at Savatthi, and had some urgent business to settle at Saketa. So between these two cities, they prepare 7 relay chariots for him. So the king Pasinadi of Kosala, living Savatthi, the king would mount the first relay chariots. So by means of these first relay chariots, he would arrive at the second relay chariots. So when the king arrived at the second relay chariots, the king would dismount from the first chariots and mount the second chariots. So by means of the second chariots, the king would arrive at the third chariots. Then he does the same thing. He would dismount from the second chariots, get on or mount the third chariots. Then in that way he would arrive at the fourth chariots and so on. Whenever Punna say that so too, the purification of moral conduct or Sila Visuddhi is for the sake of reaching purification of mind or Citta Visuddhi. And purification of mind or Citta Visuddhi is for the sake of reaching purification of will or Ditti Visuddhi. And purification of will or Ditti Visuddhi is for the sake of purification by overcoming doubt, or there's Kankha Vitarana Visuddhi. So this Kankha Vitarana Visuddhi, or purification by overcoming doubt, is for the sake of reaching purification by knowledge and vision of what is the path and what is not the path, or Magga Yana Dasana Visuddhi. So the Magga Yana Dasana Visuddhi is for the sake of reaching purification by knowledge and vision of the path, or Patipada Yana Dasana Visuddhi. So Yana Dasana Visuddhi is for the sake of reaching final Nibbana without clinging. It is for the sake of reaching final Nibbana without clinging that the holy life is lived under the Buddha or the Buddha Sasana. So similarly, you have to go through all these stages of purification in order to attain the final Nibbana without clinging. So to attain the first stage of purification, or Sila Visuddhi, you have to observe precepts. For example, 9 precepts during the retreats, or at home. You have to purify your virtue by observing the 5 moral precepts. Purifications of Sila here refers to 3 kinds of viratis, or 3 kinds of abstinences as taught in the Abhidhamma. The 3 kinds of viratis are right speech, or right actions, and right livelihood. So in other words, when you are practicing mindfulness meditation intensively here, you are abstaining from wrong speech, such as telling lies, musavada, or divisive speech, pisuna vacha, harsh speech, or idle chatters. You are also abstaining from wrong actions. You are abstaining from killing or taking what is not given, sexual misconduct. You are also abstaining from wrong livelihood, such as trading in poisons, intoxicants, slavery, or raising livestock or animals for slaughterings and so on. So when you could observe your moral precepts well, then your virtue or moral conduct is purified. So here, based on purification of virtue, we develop mindfulness. We develop mindfulness, or we practice vipassana bhavana inside meditations. So we have to develop mindfulness from one movement to next movement. We have to be mindful from one object to next object. If there's a lot of gap appear between one mindfulness and next mindfulness, then it's difficult to attain purification of mind. Here, purification of mind, citta visuddhi, means the mind that is free from 5 mental hindrances as well as other mental defilements. So as you know, there are 5 mental hindrances. The first is hindrance of sensual pleasures or sensual desire, or kama chanda or nivarana. The second hindrance is hindrance of ill will or vyapada nivarana. The third is hindrance of sloth and torpor or tina mida nivarana. And the fourth is a hindrance of restless and remorse or udacha kukucha nivarana. And the fifth is a hindrance of skeptical doubt or vichikicha nivarana. So as long as the mind is not free from these hindrances, then it's not possible to gain a deep concentration. So it is not possible to attain sharp insight knowledge, or the insight knowledge would be very weak. So these 5 hindrances are the objects of mindfulness meditation, as taught in the Dhammanupassana Satipatthana, or mindfulness of Dhamma. Hindrances can arise due to mainly effort. In other words, lacking of effort, then hindrances can arise. So if meditators put forth enough effort or strenuous effort, then it's not possible for hindrances to arise. Even the hindrance does arise, they could overcome it immediately. So meditators have to increase the effort gradually. Hindrances can arise also due to unwise reflections or ayoniso manasikara. For example, during the practice of sitting meditation or walking meditations, sometimes meditators were thinking, this practice is very boring. I could not gain anything, and so on. So when they see these thoughts, this practice is very boring, then consciously or unconsciously, the effort is getting less, and the interest in the practice also getting weaker and weaker. So eventually, the mind getting sluggish, drowsy, and fall into sleepiness. So it's important to mindful and note all these mental hindrances. All these mental hindrances are mental states. If meditators are not able to overcome these hindrances, then it's not possible to purify the mind, or in other words, to attain deep concentration. So meditators have to put forth effort to be mindful of the hindrances, for example, sleepy, and note sleepy. At the same time, be mindful of that mental state of the sleepiness. So it's important to mindful and note that hindrance, for example, sleepiness, until it has disappeared. So meditators have to mindful and note every mental hindrance. And the most important is to be patient with the mind, with the hindrances. So during mindfulness meditations, meditators have to put forth to develop mindfulness constantly and continuously. Meditators should not allow the mind to stay quiet for few movements, or stay in idleness for few movements, and so on. Sati is the translated mindfulness. Actually, it also implies paying full attention or full awareness to one phenomenon or one object at each moment. At the beginning of the practice, mindfulness meditators are not able to pay full awareness or full attention to one object or one phenomenon. For example, when you are mindful of the movements of rising, falling of the abdomen during sitting, as you're mindful and note it as rising, the mind is still conscious of other things or other less distinct objects. So meditators have to increase the effort gradually, so that meditators could mindful or perceive the movements of the rising or the movements of falling clearer and clearer. As the meditators are mindful of the rising movements or the falling movements, then the mindfulness perceives a strong pain that is more distinct than the movements of rising or the movement of falling. Then they should be mindful of that strong pain immediately. So as the meditators are mindful of the strong pain, they should not concern about the movements of rising, falling anymore. Sometimes meditators are mindful of pain or other object. They also keep an eye on the movements of the movements of rising and falling. In that way, their mindfulness on the pain is distracted by that conscious effort, like conscious effort to check the abdomen, keep an eye to the rising, falling movement abdomen. In other words, when meditators are mindful of that strong pain, they train their mindfulness or the mind to pay full attention or full awareness to the pain, or they should not take interest in the movements of rising and falling anymore. If the pain getting weaker, or in other words, the intensity of the pain getting weaker, and the movements of rising or the movements of falling becomes clearer than that pain, then the mindfulness will notice that clear movements of rising or the falling naturally. So when meditators mindfulness notices the movements of rising is clearer, then they should mindful and note the process of rising movements. At that time, they should not find out whether the pain has disappeared or not. So meditators should pay attention to the movements of rising, pay full attention to the movements of rising and the movement of falling at that time. If meditators notice there's a thinking, then they should be mindful and note the thinking mind immediately. They should not try to control or keep their mindfulness with the movements of rising or the movements of falling. So when the thinking has disappeared by itself, if the movements of rising is very clear, the mindfulness will notice it. Then meditators should be mindful and note the rising movements immediately. Or when the thinking mind has disappeared, and then next moment a strong pain arising, then the mindfulness will notice a strong pain. Then meditators should follow the mindfulness and note the strong pain. So in other words, when the mindfulness is progressing or improving, meditators would realize that they do not have to choose the object. The mindfulness will choose the object by itself. If meditators have the tendency to choose the object, then this is not the way of the mindfulness meditation. So the mindfulness meditation is also known as choiceless awareness in English, or you do not make a choice to choose your object. But meditators have to make an effort to keep the mindfulness with the strongest object or the most distinct object. For example, when you are mindful of the rising movements or the falling movements of abdomen, when the movements is very clear, then there's a weak pain arising. The mindfulness immediately goes to that weak pain. Then this is not the correct way, the right way. So it doesn't mean that when we say choiceless awareness, then we allow the mindfulness to go to other less distinct objects or other or objects that are external, for example, the sound or the noise. So when we talk about choiceless awareness, it doesn't mean that we allow the mindfulness to go to the less distinct object or the sound or noise outside. If you allow the mind to move freely between freely to many objects, eventually your mind will become restless. So that's the reason we lay down the principle or the guidelines of the practice of mindfulness. So the principle or the guidelines of the practice of mindfulness is to be mindful and note whatever object that is predominantly arising at that moment as it really occurs. So meditators have to put forth effort so that the mindfulness stay with the most dominant object. When meditators are mindful of any physical phenomena or bodily sensations, then there's a thinking arising or any mental states arising at that moment. So they should be mindful and note that thinking or that mental state that's arising at that moment. Sometimes meditators could perceive the rising movements and the falling movement of abdomen clearly, yet the mind is thinking of something. So they continue to mindful and note the movements of rising, falling, and they think that they have the idea that the thinking is not clear. So they make an effort to keep the mindfulness with the movements of rising, falling. In actual fact, that thinking or any mental state that's arising at that moment is very clear. But sometimes meditators put an effort to keep the mindfulness with the rising and falling movements. So they say that thinking is not clear. In actual fact, that thinking is very clear. Is very near to the following mental states. In actual fact, that thinking is very clear to the following mental states. In other words, the awareness or the mindfulness. How do you perceive the mental states? Or what comes to realize that there's a mental state arising, there's a thinking, and so on? What comes to know that there's a thinking or there's a mental state arising? Are you able to know the mental state for the thinking through your eyes or by hearing from your ears? You cannot see the mental state through your eyes or hear the mental state through your ear. So the mental state that's arising at that present moment is perceived by another mental state in the following moment, in the next moment. So when you know there's a thinking mind, actually that thinking mind is being known or perceived by the following mental states, or in other words, awareness. Or you become aware that there was a thinking in the previous moment. So between these two mental states, do you think these two mental states are very far away? They are very not far away, very, very near to each other. Only the previous one has passed away, then the present one can arise. But sometimes you may think the thinking and the mindfulness like arising at the same time or happening at the same time. Or if you make an effort to keep your mindfulness with the movement arising, falling, then you may think the thinking mind is not clear, it's very weak. Or sometimes meditators know there's a thinking, but at the same time they also see that the mindfulness is still with the movements of rising, movements of falling. But in actual fact, the mind cannot perceive two things at the same time. The mind perceives one object after another very rapidly, so fast, so rapid that it gives us a wrong impression that the mind perceives 2-3 things at the same moment. So it is important to develop your mindfulness so that your mindfulness is quite alert to the arising of any mental states. So when the mindfulness is alert and active, that mindfulness will be able to mindful and note any mental states instantly or immediately. So when mental state disappear, then the mindfulness would mindful and note the next object. Next object could be a physical phenomena or body sensation, whichever is more distinct or more dominant. So in the way, meditators training the mind or the mindfulness to be mindful from one moment to next moment and from one object to next object. So at each moment, the meditators are only interested in one object, training the mind or the mindfulness to pay full attention to one object. So when meditators are able to pay full attention or full object to full attention or full awareness to one object at each moment, and the mind is quite free from hindrances, then they would gradually attain deeper and deeper concentration. So meditators have to increase the effort gradually and training the mindfulness to mindful of the phenomena in more and more details. For example, when meditators mindful of the rising movements or the falling movement of movements, or when they are mindful of their walking meditations, the movements of the foot, lifting, pushing, dropping, and so on. At the beginning of practice, meditators could not perceive the whole process clearly. When they put forth effort, gradually they could see every process of rising clearly, or every process of falling clearly, or the process of lifting movements, pushing movements, and dropping movements clearly during the walking meditations. So when they keep on increasing the effort and be mindful of the movements more and more attentively, precisely, gradually they may realize that the rising movements is not a single process. Meditators may begin to realize that there are 2-3 processes of rising. So when the mindfulness getting sharper, concentration is getting deeper, meditators may be able to realize more and more processes of rising in that rising movements. So we can say that the mindfulness is perceive one object at each movement, then that object disappear instantly, there will be another object arising. So in the Visuddhimagga explained as a momentary unification of the mind. Yes. So that means concentration only lasts for a moment. It's because every object is arising and passing away instantly. The mindfulness and the concentration can only stay with that object for a moment. Then another object arising, the mindfulness and the concentration stay with that next object also for a moment. So if this moment to moment mindfulness and concentration are not interrupted by hindrances or defilements, then gradually meditators would attain purification of mind. So the commentary Visuddhimagga explained as if the mind is absorbed into the phenomenon for a moment. So it's quite similar to the samatha bhavana, but in the practice of concentration meditation, the mind is absorbed into the object of concentration for a period of time, depending on the effort and the skill in the concentration. But in the practice of mindfulness meditation, the mindfulness cannot absorb by the object for more than a moment. Do you know why? It's because when meditators attain that deep concentration, meditators realize that every object is arising and passing away very instantly. It doesn't last even for more than a moment. So when one object has disappeared, then there will be another object arising. So can you choose what is the next object to arise? Are you able to choose what is the next object going to arise? You cannot predict what object going to arise in the next moment. So you have to put your full awareness on the present object. But in accordance with these 7 stages of purifications, meditators have to realize the specific characteristics of the phenomena. In Pali, it's known as sabhava lakkhana. So in other words, when you are able to realize the 3 common characteristics, samayana lakkhana, at that time you should also be able to realize the sabhava lakkhana. So in other words, in accordance with the 7 stages of purifications, you realize sabhava lakkhana, then only come to realize samayana lakkhana. So when you attain purification of mind, then you begin to realize the specific characteristics of the material elements. For example, you only realize there's a rising movements, and there's a process of falling movements. Or when you're mindful of your walking meditations, you only realize that there's a lifting process, there's a pushing process, there's a dropping process. You only realize that there are movements. So at that moment, you are not conscious of your foot. Or when you are mindful of the rising, falling movements during sitting, you are no longer conscious of the abdomen, except there's a movement. So if meditators perceive a strong object, for example, hot, meditators only realize that this object of hot or phenomena of hot. The meditators do not realize as my body is hot or my back is very cold and so on. At the same moment, meditators realize that there's a mental state of mindfulness or awareness, usually known as the noting mind in English. So, which one has a function to know or to cognize the object? So here, only the mind, in other words, the mindfulness has a function to cognize, to know the physical phenomena, or in Pali it's known as rupa. So meditators realize at each movement there's a pair of process. One is a mental process, there's the awareness or the noting mind. The other is a physical process, could be the rising movements or the falling movements and so on. So at each movement, there are these 2 processes. One is the mental process, the other is physical process. Meditators could not identify these processes with a person, a being, or a self, a soul. So at that times, that experience remove the wrong view of a person, a being, or a self, or a soul. So at that time, meditators attain purification of view. Meditators can attain purification of view because they have attained purification of mind. So when meditators attain purification of view, then they can only gain or attain the next purification, or purification by overcoming doubts. So meditators begin to realize the relationship between the object, for example, the rising movements, or the falling movements, and the noting mind. So do you know what's the relationship between the object, for example, the rising movements, and the noting mind? Which one condition the other to arise? Which process condition the other process to arise? The rising movements condition the arising of the noting mind. If the rising movement doesn't appear, can the noting mind appear? It cannot appear. So it's because there's appearance of the rising movements, then the noting mind or the awareness will appear immediately. So if you practice correctly, rightly, in accordance with the principle and the guideline of practice, as well as the technique of mindfulness meditation, eventually you come to realize this knowledge. Then when you are mindful of your walking meditations or your daily activities, then you may realize that the movements is also conditioned by the mind. So do you know your movements, lifting, pushing, or when you're mindful of the stretching movements, bending movements, do you know what are the conditions of these processes of movements? So you realize these processes also conditioned by the mind, in other words, intention. So when you could realize the intention clearly, do you think that there's an I or self commanding the bodily movements? Or is there an I behind these lifting movements? Is there an I giving command to the pushing movements and so on? There's no I or a self, except there's this mental process of intention that's arising by itself. So you can see the interdependence of the nama rupa. Sometimes the rupa depending on the mind, sometimes the mind depending on the physical phenomena or rupa. So could you think of any example that the mind dependent on the physical phenomena? So during sitting, first you have to experience that there's rising movements. So because of this rising movements is one of physical phenomena, so it conditions the arising of the mind. So the arising of the mind, or in other words, the mindfulness depending on this physical phenomenon. And sometimes you realize that the physical phenomena, the arising of physical phenomena depending on the mind. So there's a rising of intention, then then that condition the arising of the process of movements. So in that way, you come to realize one of the important teachings. There's a teaching of conditionality or dependent originations. You also come to realize the law of cause and effect. We can only understand the law of cause and effect well when we can understand the conditionality. So that's why we say conditionality, cause and effect, or karma and conditionality, karma and its results. So it's different from those who talk about cause and effect, but they do not know about conditionality. But so is the different from those who understand cause and effect, but they do not know about conditionality. So you can understand the essence of teaching better when you practice mindfulness meditation correctly. Then only you come to realize the three common characteristics of nama and rupa. So you have to keep in mind about these 7 stages of purifications in your practice. When you keep on practicing and experience repeatedly, then the experience becomes clear to your mind. But the most important is that meditators should not analyze during the practice. We realize the knowledge through mindfulness and direct experience. So meditators have to keep on practicing and have to experience the nama rupa again. Then they may realize the knowledge clearly. So I wish every meditators practice the mindfulness meditation or satipatthana meditation correctly, as taught in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, and gain these 7 stages of purifications, remove all the mental defilements, and attain the final enlightenment, or the final stage of enlightenment.